Story 1. The silence is the first thing that gets you. Not a peaceful city dweller's idea of quiet, but a deep, oppressive silence that feels heavy, like a woolen blanket soaked in water. That's what I remember most about the cabin before it all went wrong. My boyfriend, Liam, had booked it for our anniversary. "A total digital detox," he'd said, smiling as he showed me the pictures online. It looked idyllic, a rustic log cabin nestled deep in the embrace of the Cascade Mountains, miles from the nearest town. It was exactly what we needed. The first day was perfect. We hiked until our legs ached, cooked dinner over an open fire, and fell asleep to the gentle sigh of the wind in the pines. It was on the second night that the silence began to curdle. It started with a scratch, a faint, rhythmic sound against the back wall of the cabin, like a branch swaying in the wind. I told myself that's all it was, pulling the covers tighter around my shoulders. Liam was already asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. But the scratching didn't stop. It grew more deliberate, more insistent. Scrape, scrape, drag. It sounded less like a branch and more like fingernails dragging down the rough-hewn logs. I sat bolt upright, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. "Liam," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Liam, wake up," he mumbled, rolling over. "What is it?" "Listen." We both held our breath. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. A watchful, waiting silence. Then, a loud thump against the front door made us both jump. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, dead-weight sound, as if someone had thrown their entire body against the wood. "Who the hell is that?" Liam hissed, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. He slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy iron fireplace poker. "Stay here." "Don't make a sound," I huddled under the blankets, my mind racing. We were hours from any help. No cell service. The park ranger who'd given us the keys had made a joke about it. "Out here, you're on your own. Make sure you know who you're with." At the time, I'd laughed. Now his words echoed with a sinister weight. Another thump at the door, harder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan that didn't sound entirely human. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Liam was at the door, peering through the tiny peephole. "I don't see anything," he whispered back, his voice strained. "It's pitch black." He began dragging the heavy oak coffee table, barricading the door with a grunt of effort. The scratching started again, this time at the window next to the door. Faster now, frantic, splintering. Whatever was out there was desperate to get in. For the next hour, we were prisoners in a symphony of terror. Thumps against the walls, the shriek of wood being clawed at, and that awful, wet moaning that seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence returned, heavier and more terrifying than ever. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. I think it's gone," Liam finally said, his voice trembling. He let the poker clatter to the floor and came back to the bed, wrapping his arms around me. I buried my face in his chest, shaking uncontrollably. He was my rock, my protector. He'd kept us safe. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the windows, a fragile sense of relief began to settle in. We were alive. We had made it through the night. I pulled away from Liam's embrace to look at his face, to reassure myself, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't one thing, but a series of small, impossible details. The dark, rich soil caked under his fingernails. The long, deep scratches running up his forearms, fresh and red against his pale skin. And the distinct, coppery smell that clung to his clothes, a smell I now recognized from the air outside the door. The smell of fear and blood. My blood ran cold. The barricade. The poker. His insistence that I stay away from the windows. It wasn't to keep something out. It was to keep me in. I looked into his eyes, the eyes of the man I loved, and for the first time, I saw the stranger behind them. The park ranger's words came back to me, no longer a joke, but a final, horrifying truth. Make sure you know who you're with. The scratching and moaning hadn't been a monster trying to break in. It was a person who had been out there in the dark with him, a person who had seen what he was, trying desperately to warn me. Story 2. The old Ford coughed and sputtered, finally dying a gracious death at the edge of the overgrown track. Ahead, barely visible through the skeletal trees, stood the cabin. It wasn't quaint. It was a skeletal thing itself, hunched and sagging, swallowed by the encroaching woods. But it was isolated, and that was all I needed. To clear my head, I'd told myself. To get away from everything. The lie felt thin even in the absolute quiet. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. I tried to dismiss it as the smell of decay, of a house left to rot. Cobwebs clung like gray lace to every corner, and dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. I dropped my bag and walked through the 4 small rooms, each one colder than the last. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight like a living thing, and a persistent draft snaked through the gaps in the walls, whispering secrets I couldn't quite decipher. Night fell fast and hard, drawing a thick, inky blanket over the cabin. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of the house settling or the rustle of unseen creatures outside. But then, I started to hear other things. Faint scratches from within the walls, like mice, I reasoned, though they seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic. A whisper, just at the edge of audibility, that vanished the moment I held my breath to listen. I rationalized it as isolation getting to me. I hadn't spoken to another soul in days, hadn't seen a familiar face. My phone was dead, no signal for miles. That was the point, wasn't it? To disconnect. But the disconnect was starting to feel less like freedom and more like a cage. The next day, things sharpened. I found the kitchen knife, the one I'd left on the counter, lying on the floor. A picture frame on the mantelpiece, depicting an old, stern-faced man, was turned to face the wall. I always closed the cellar door, a heavy, groaning slab of wood in the corner of the small living room. But twice, I found it ajar, revealing a sliver of inky blackness. I started barricading it with a chair. Sleep became a struggle. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every mundane sound transformed into something sinister. I swore I heard footsteps above me, though the cabin only had 1 floor. I'd grab the old rusty axe I'd found leaning against the back door, heart pounding, and creep through the rooms, finding nothing but my own ragged reflection in the dark windows. One evening, as I stared into the blackness beyond the glass, I saw it. A fleeting silhouette, tall and gaunt, flitting between the trees. My breath hitched. Someone was out there. Someone was watching. The fear became a living entity within me, cold and gnawing. I boarded up the windows, leaving only tiny slits to peer out, making the cabin even darker, more oppressive. The scratching in the walls intensified, moving, it seemed, from room to room, chasing me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, always just out of reach, like a name being called from a dream. They were coming from everywhere now. The floorboards, the ceiling, even the air itself. One night, the rhythmic scratching turned into a furious clawing, radiating from the cellar door. The chair I'd wedged against it began to shake. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floor. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else, something ancient and hungry, trapped beneath my feet, or trying to break in. I backed away, stumbling over furniture I couldn't see in the near-total darkness. My makeshift weapon, a length of splintered wood, felt utterly useless. The growl deepened, punctuated by wet, thudding impacts against the cellar door. It sounded like something was trying to batter its way out, or in. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? I was miles from civilization, and the cabin was surrounded. I pressed myself into a corner, eyes wide, breath catching in my throat. The thudding grew louder, punctuated by the terrible, frantic scratching. The whole cabin thrummed with the sound. The whispers, too, were unmistakable now, forming fractured, garbled words, echoing off the walls. "Let me out! Help me! You did this!" My blood ran cold. The chair slid, scraping against the floorboards as the cellar door bucked inward. A sliver of darkness, even blacker than the room, yawned open. A putrid metallic smell billowed out, so potent it made my eyes water. Then, the thudding stopped. The scratching ceased. The whispers fell silent. An unnatural stillness descended, heavier, more suffocating than any I had known. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs, for the beast, the entity, the madman to emerge from the black maw of the cellar. Nothing. Only the silence, and the overwhelming stench. I stared at the open cellar door, my vision slowly adjusting to the gloom. It was then, in that profound, awful quiet, that I looked down at my hands. They were caked in something dark, viscous, and drying. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't mud. My stomach lurched. My gaze drifted to the length of splintered wood I was clenching so tightly. Number. It wasn't wood. It was an axe. Not the rusty one from the back door, but a heavy gleaming cleaver, its blade dulled by something dark and slick. My eyes swept around the room, taking in the scene with a horrifying clarity I had suppressed for days. The floorboards weren't just dusty, they were stained, a sprawling dark map. The metallic smell wasn't old blood. It was fresh, clinging to every surface. The whispers had been my own frantic thoughts. The scratching, the sound of my fingernails tearing at the wood in a desperate, futile attempt to bury something. The cellar door wasn't just old, it was new, hastily installed, and smeared with effort. And the growl, the thudding, the panicked clawing. It wasn't trying to get out of the cellar, it was trying to get in. And I was standing right in front of it. I wasn't a guest in this cabin. I was its prisoner. And the thing I had come here to escape was myself. My hands trembled, the cleaver suddenly impossibly heavy. The truth, sharper than any blade, sliced through the fog of my memory, painting the walls of my mind crimson. The cabin had never been empty, and the monster was never outside.